Hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Lipman. I am a journalist, an author, an editor, and a proud member of the class of 1983. Welcome to Raising Our Voices, Yale Women on the Record. We are about to hear from a rock star lineup of Yale journalist women. And let me just quickly introduce them. We've got so much to talk about in this day and age. Jane Mayer is class of 1977. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker, the magazine's chief Washington correspondent. She covers politics, culture, national security. We also have Monica Drake, class of 1994. She's an assistant managing editor for the New York Times. She oversees new editorial, digital, and other initiatives. She is the first African-American woman on the print masthead of the New York Times. Sarah Stillman is class of 2006. She's a staff writer for The New Yorker. She teaches journalism at Yale, and she also is the founding director of Columbia Journalism School's Global Migration Project. And Tessa Berenson, class of 2014, is a White House correspondent for Time magazine. So we have here, I want to start just to level set, because we have almost 40 years worth of journalism represented on this panel. And I'd like to start with Jane, if I may, who was one of the very few women in the early 1980s to cover the Reagan White House. And I think the press room at that time, if Jane, maybe you could share with us a little bit about what the press room was like at that time, and then Tessa can explain how that has changed.
Hi, Joanne. Jane's having some technical issues, so we're going to get her on as soon as possible. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay, no problem. We will go then to Tessa. You are covering the White House right now. Tell us a little bit about your experience in the press room. I mean, we know that at this moment in time that we have a president who calls the press the enemy of the people. We have seen that he has a lot of trouble, in particular, interacting with female journalists who are powerful women. Tell us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, so just to tell everyone a little bit about how I got here. So I've been at Time for 6 years. I started as a summer intern in 2014, right after I graduated Yale, and never left. And then when the presidential campaigns were starting to heat up in 2015, since I was the youngest member of Time's DC bureau and I'd never covered a campaign before, they gave me the outsider candidates. So I had Ben Carson, Carly Fiorina, and Donald Trump. So I've been covering Donald Trump since the day he announced his run for presidency 5 years ago. And when he won, I had the chance to take over the White House beat from fellow Yaley Zeke Miller when Zeke left to go to the AP. And as I said, now I'm regularly in the press room covering him, and it's been sort of a fascinating way to begin a career in journalism. So, you know, one particular anecdote that comes to mind is I was there in the briefing room this year in April on the day that President Trump suggested that ingesting bleach might help cure COVID-19. And when he left the room after the briefing, there was just this really stunned silence among the reporters in the room. And there were not very many of us because of the coronavirus restrictions and social distancing. And there was just this stunned silence, and we kind of looked at each other, and there was almost some nervous sort of gasps. And it just shows that 5 years on, President Trump still has the capacity to shock and surprise, and he's keeping us on our toes every single day.
Monica, the way that we tell that story has also changed, I think, quite a bit. If we look back at, you know, when I started back in the 1980s, it was all about print. You know, internet was barely sort of a spark in anybody's eyes at that time. And now we have an entirely new vernacular for storytelling, which I believe is really your area of expertise. Can you tell us a little bit about that, the new ways of storytelling?
Yeah, sure. What's really striking is that much of journalism involves the sort of person-to-person contact that Tessa was just talking about. But there is now this vast infrastructure that kind of supports that and decides the way that stories are framed and told. And it used to be fairly uncomplicated. There was an assigning editor who managed the words, or if there was video, there's a video producer and editors. But right now, the way that journalism is done involves skills that are newly emerging and not necessarily the traditional disciplines that women take up as their training to be journalists. So, for example, recently we did a mail tracker story that captured information about mail delivery based on data from a company that tracks 29 million pieces of first-class mail. A more traditional way of telling the story would be to talk to people in the Postal Service, talk to people at that company, try to pluck some really colorful anecdotes. But right now, people want a lot of information that involves numbers. So what that meant was you have to have facility with data science. You have to build an interactive chart. And so as newsrooms are reaching gender parity, we really want to make sure to groom women to take up these sorts of innovative ways of telling stories.
I think that's a really great point. I do want to put a pin in that for a moment, because we do want to get back to the role of women in the newsroom. But I want to stay for a moment on where we are now. And I mean, this is the most fraught time that I can recall certainly in my long career as a journalist. Between the polarization in the country, the pandemic, now this fight over the election, the question of whether the president will accept a peaceful transition of power. We've really never been in a position like this. And I'd like to go to Sarah, because, you've spent so much of your career reporting from overseas. You've reported from Iraq, from Afghanistan. You've reported on wars, human rights abuses. So you're able to sort of have a more global perspective. And I'm wondering, given what you've seen around the world, what is your take, almost as an outsider, on what is going on in the United States right now?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me on this panel, and forgive me if I'm on a little lag here. But it's funny you should bring up Iraq, because I was a freshman in college when the Iraq War began. And when I graduated, I knew I wanted to cover the war. And so I went off to Iraq, and I remember I was just thinking about an experience where I landed in Iraq. I got there my very first day. And the public affairs officer who picked me up on the largest U.S. military base in Baghdad was driving me to where I was going to sleep, and mentioned that someone had been electrocuted in the shower the previous day, a service member. And I was so new to this world, and I had no idea what was going on. Of course, this absolutely shocked me, but everyone around me was just acting like this was a normal fact. So throughout my day, figured maybe my instinct is wrong here, and just went on to the next. Went on to my bedroom, went on to the next reporting project. And then about a month later, the New York Times came out with a massive front-page piece saying 18 service members had been electrocuted in the showers in Iraq and died that way. And it taught me such a good journalistic lesson that I think is very applicable to your question right now, which is that we have to find ways to preserve our capacity to be shocked, and we have to trust our instincts about what can shock us. And I recently, just this weekend, heard the term malignant normalcy to describe when so many deeply perverse things are happening in such a bombarding way that you can start to lose capacity to be shocked as a journalist, but also as a reader. And I think that's really one of the big challenges right now, certainly for me covering immigration, where it's a balance between both retaining my ability to be shocked by certain things that feel deeply inhumane, but also not getting to the point where everything is reported in a way that strips away dignity by virtue of simply showing people, imposters, immigrants in particular, imposters of being denigrated and having violence done to them. So that to me has been one of the fundamental challenges of reporting on immigration in particular in this moment.
Monica, as well, and at the New York Times, I think one of the issues that we see there is it's been singled out as being the enemy of the people. Now, we've seen this directed at journalists writ large, but in particular at the New York Times. How does that impact your role as a journalist? How does that impact people within the newsroom?
Well, I have to say it is tough for morale. Just personally, we have people in war zones doing really difficult stories, and we prioritize, of course, original reporting on the scene. And during a pandemic, we go to great lengths to bring people the stories. So I think that framing does affect our morale. I also think, though, that it makes us more committed to the mission of what we're doing. It's made us be much more probably deliberate and transparent about the lengths we go to bring people stories. So that constant sort of backdrop of, they're not really telling you what happened. We counter that every day with people on the scene, recording video, recording audio, and also people who are, scattered throughout the country and the world, working remotely, parsing video and breaking stories about our world. So I think it's something that we try to keep in mind. It's actually a management challenge as a manager, I would say, to keep people motivated, when that's happening. But it's made people just much more attached to the importance of what we do.
And we have a parallel situation happening within newsrooms where, and Jane, are you with us, Jane? Because perhaps you can.
I'm here. I don't know. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. So Jane, talking about sort of the mission of the journalist, one of the things that you and I have spoken about before is this, it's almost like a generation gap between journalists who grew up in sort of the objective, almost view from nowhere sort of position versus now where younger journalists are very often more likely to be see themselves as having a mission, having an advocacy, and rejecting this sort of pure objective reporting. Can talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a real generational gap there, and it's kind of shocking if you've grown up as I did in coming out of Yale and trying to look at reporting as sort of just bringing people the facts and earning all kinds of respect for doing that. And we are now the enemy of the people, and the younger generation feels that we really need to deplatform people who have noxious things to say, and that we need to as you say, be advocates, really, as opposed to sort of presenting both sides as, in kind of equal sort of grandeur. It's it's a very difficult issue to navigate. I understand exactly why my younger peers feel this way. It feels like we're in a very dangerous moment in this country. I think, so I really understand why people feel the need to advocate and try to stand up to anti-democratic forces. I think my greatest concern is that if you do wind up writing stories that really twist the facts to try to serve your agenda politically, that you're going to wind up undercutting yourself. My fear is that you're going to then basically undercut your own credibility. And what I've been intent on doing is being really rigorous, checking every fact, reaching out to everybody who on all sides, not necessarily because they're all telling the truth, but exposing the lies for what they are. And to do that, I need to have my own credibility stand up. And so I don't want to be discarded as just a political player and another liar with a political point of view. The press, I think, has to have a special kind of spot where we are believed. Everything sort of flows from that. I think back to the days when I was a reporter briefly in Beirut, and in 1983 it was pretty soon after I left Yale. Reporters, unlike other people, could go to every faction of the war. You had a kind of a pass that allowed you to be able to see all kinds of people and go through green lines and police lines and everything else. And that was because we were supposed to be there as people representing the truth, sort of the eyes of the public. And I don't want to lose that. And so I think it's really important, and I don't want to be looked at as the opposite of Fox, because I don't think Fox is in the same business as the New Yorker magazine or the New York Times for that matter. So I think it's a dangerous situation for reporters to twist facts even in the service of some higher point that they think is higher than the truth. I think the truth's got to be the highest thing we serve, always.
Can I hop in here for a second, Joanne?
Please do.
Okay. So I just think it's Jane's answer coming right after Monica's answer is really interesting, because I think those two questions are really related about this new idea, or this idea that President Trump has brought more to the forefront of journalists being the enemy of the people and fake news, with the question of more activist journalism versus still striving for objectivity. So I'm a very poor representative of my generation if we're framing this as a generational divide, because I also feel very strongly that journalists need to keep striving for that objectivity and a sense of neutrality. And I think it's based on these past 6 years where I've become a journalist in the Trump era. And there's this sort of disturbing trend where there's now this really established link between complaints about liberal media bias, which are not new and have been around for a long time. But that's now a pretty quick slope from the liberal media to fake news to misinformation and conspiracy theories, because President Trump has given people this language to feel that if their news coverage is slanted in some way, then actually it just means it's fake, it's not real, and then they're going to try and find their facts elsewhere. And that's where their facts elsewhere. And that's where we get into, I think, a lot of the really dangerous proliferation of conspiracy theories we have now. So I think it's actually more important than ever for journalists to keep striving for this fair coverage and objectivity, because the further this split widens between where people are finding their information and the less established ground we have of what is fair journalism, I think that's an incredibly dangerous trend that the president has been exacerbating as well.
Joanne, can I chime in as well?
Please.
I think it might also help to just give a little peek behind the curtain, transparency-wise, about our journalistic methodology and process, because I know probably everyone on this call could speak to the issues that we face in the fact-checking process, but certainly Jane and I at the New Yorker have many tales around that. And I can just give one example of the kind of fastidious nature of the New Yorker fact-checking process that is so integral to helping the public understand how it is we do what we do. But I was writing a story about confidential informants who are killed in the process of working with police in the war on drugs. And I remember that I said in the piece that the protagonist of the story sat down on her tan suede couch. And the fact checker actually went to such lengths as to discern that the couch was actually made of a microfiber that resembled suede. It was not an actual tan suede couch. So at the New Yorker, like that, those are the kinds of lengths we go to. And I think it's increasingly, as much as I really want to echo all the other panelists in regard to the values of retaining some modicum of perhaps not objectivity, but at least like a fundamental drive towards fairness and towards truth. I think it's important that we also offer more transparency into our process, and fact checking is, I think, a really big part of that.
Right, which gets to the point of how do we win back the trust of the public? How do we convince people that a fact is a fact? Is it by the kind of fact-checking that the New Yorker does on the fact-checking desk? Was that person's sweater actually purple when you quoted them? Or is it being upfront and calling a lie, which in newsrooms has been extremely controversial when a political candidate or the president says something that is not true. Do you call it a lie? This has been a huge point of contention among journalists because it could suggest intent. And I'm curious, how do we draw the line? How do we make people, how do we increase the trust in our reporting?
I can speak to the question of how we characterize misrepresentations of the truth by public officials. One thing that the Times have done, obviously, is that we don't always use the word lie because it does have intentionality. But we do say pretty much in an adjective form before the statement or whatever, that we make it clear that what the person is saying is indeed not true. I think that is one step. I guess I want to take a bit of a step back, though, if we're talking about what is a fact and what makes a story. I think, we at the Times are now thinking of this as not necessarily entirely objective or balanced, but really our goal is fully dimensional storytelling. And so what that means is that if you are writing a story about something that seems like it may be an uncomplicated story even, but it's fraud, say where our coverage of Amy Cooper threatening to call the police on a black bird watcher in Central Park. If you approach that story as just a way of getting information out there and not really trying to capture the full essence of what happened, you would just publish the clip that went viral and some sort of intro text surrounding it. But our goal there is to talk to the bird watcher, to try to talk to her, to try to talk to people in Central Park, to try to get and talk to people who are sort of impartial observers of this dynamic. So we want to deliver the complete story rather than just a sliver of facts. And I think that those stories most resonate with audiences and readers and viewers. And I think people will believe you and they actually understand when you're telling a story and you're interviewing a lot of people just to give them the full story rather than interviewing one side versus another in an attempt at sort of false balance.
I will also say that I think obviously Monica is correct that the resulting story will be much stronger for all of that. And I know it sounds Pollyannish, but in terms of how we win back the trust of the public, I think the actual act of doing those interviews, I like to think I'm sort of helping regain the trust of people who've lost faith in the media every time I talk to them and am doing my job in a respectful and fair way. I've been to numerous Trump rallies over the past 5 years, and it's very often I will be talking to someone who will say, no offense, but I don't believe anything I read in the media, or the media never covers this, or the media never talks about his crowds. And I'm sort of thinking, well, I'm the media and I'm right here and I'm talking to you and I'm covering this. And so I think I like to think that every time I can have one of those interactions, it can play a small part in trying to mend this sort of frayed relationship as well.
To go back to this issue, there's a big difference, though, of course, between neutrality and objectivity, and you can wind up as a reporter reporting the facts and come out with a very strong point of view. I mean, I don't want to be on the record appearing to be in favor of false equivalence of that everybody has equal right to the truth. It's exactly the opposite. As far as I'm concerned, there are things that are true, and then there are lots of lies. And I actually feel quite comfortable calling a lot of what's coming out of this White House lies, because at a certain point, when a president lies as often as Trump does, it's not an accident anymore. It's a strategy. It's a tactic. And in fact, there's an interesting thing in Bob Woodward's new book where he talks about he interviews Jared Kushner, and Kushner tells him what you've really got to understand is there's a particular book that explains how he lies. And he lies on purpose because when a public official lies, it creates conflict and it brings attention to him. And it's a way he brings attention to a subject he wants to talk about. When he says, I have the greatest economy ever, we all know it's not the greatest economy ever. But by the time the reporters have rushed in and we're all correcting it, we're all talking about what he wants to talk about, which is his economy. And we're not talking about something else that maybe he doesn't want to talk about. So, I think part of what we need to do is not just correct the lies, but to write about lying as a strategy and why public officials manipulate the truth the way they do, and why maybe Kellyanne Conway came out in the very beginning saying there are alternative facts, which we know is also just a euphemism for lies. Why are they attacking the press? Because they want to try to spoon feed some kind of point of view that's not factual. and they want to try to, manipulate public opinion. I think part of what we need to do is write about the process with a little more sophistication, maybe. And so, and I think the other thing we have to do, which we do at the New Yorker, and I think most mainstream media outlets do, is we need to acknowledge mistakes when we make them, and so that we care about what's accurate and what's not, and everybody makes mistakes, and everybody should correct them. And that's something you don't see Trump doing, and it's something you don't really see Fox doing, except when its back is up against the wall. So I think all those things would help.
So very much related to, go on.
So I wanted to chime in just with one more thought on a strategy. All of that really resonates. I think another way of working into that, working around Trump's kind of agenda setting through lying is really by reporting on that gulf between like the rhetorical claims and the empirical reality. And Monica had mentioned earlier, working with data. And one thing that's interesting in some realms, like certainly in the immigration realm, early on, at least in the Trump administration, there wasn't really a lot of data to work with as you tried to bridge the gulf between the rhetoric and the empirical reality of what immigrants and certainly undocumented folks and asylum seekers in America were facing. So I just want to share an example of how I kind of tried to report into that by, I actually worked with a class at Columbia Journalism School in the Global Migration Project. And we kept something we called the Trump Tracker. And this was in the time when Trump was saying the only people we're going after in terms of interior immigration enforcement are the quote unquote bad hombres, men with criminal records. And instead, I had students logging every single incident of immigration enforcement they could find. We basically just divided up the country. We acted like we were sort of a mini law school clinic, borrowing from the Yale Law School's model of kind of dividing up a classroom. Every student had a set of states. And then when we started looking into those stories and reporting them out, we ended up telling for the New Yorker a number of stories of mothers with no criminal record who were rounded up after minor traffic stops and deported in a matter, in some cases, of days. And so I think sometimes just telling those direct stories and making your own data where it doesn't exist in ways that refute some of the narratives we're being told about what exactly is happening enforcement-wise can be another way to address the problems we're talking about.
Another element of everything that we're discussing here, though, is actually the personal behavior of journalists, which is actually more visible than ever because so many journalists are active on social media. One of the really interesting debates that I've seen within newsrooms is whether journalists should be permitted now. Previously, just for those who are listening, previously, the standard journalistic practice was you can't participate in any kind of political campaign. You can't be open about what your politics are. You don't protest in street protests. But increasingly, we're in this moment, particularly of racial reckoning right now. And you hear newsrooms now saying that, yeah, that's okay. You can protest. And I'm curious where you all come out on that.
But I mean, the New York Times, we have a pretty firm policy on it that we try to adhere to. I mean, I will say that the best use of social media for journalists is to actually listen and use it as a reporting tool as much as you can, and a potential distribution tool. That's what we found. Chances are, if you are going, and we're talking about Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram probably, if you go on these platforms and you're only confronted with opinions of people who you might run into at a cocktail party when we had those things, then chances are you kind of aren't really exploring it and mining it for the communities and people that you're less familiar with. And that can yield stories. For instance, a year ago or so, I noticed that there were a lot of Trump supporters who are Black and very outspoken online. And I talked to our politics editor about it, and we realized this was a concerted effort by the president to gain the Black vote, that he actually thought that he had potential to make inroads there. And we ran one of the early stories on it. And many of these people were, religious conservatives and not living on either coast. So in states in the South, and they're not people who I would run into at the farmers market in Brooklyn, but because I was in those communities, we started to see a trend. So I actually think social media, if you are a journalist and you're using it, it can help your storytelling. And I also think that in terms of the whether you should be active or not, with basic things, I think that we are advocates of truth, of rendering society in its most active form. So when I say that we're mission driven, I think our mission is our commitment to render the world as it really is. And if you want to do something else, if you want to sort of post much more on social media, then maybe our opinion section is a good place to be, or maybe another media outlet.
On social media, on the topic of social media, I mean, this is actually a really fraught issue for female journalists in particular. We know that women online are abused far more frequently than men. There's been quite a few studies done on this. The research shows that women generally, and particularly female journalists, are threatened with bodily harm, with sexual attack in a way that men are not. And I wonder if, how does that impact us and what are we seeing? I think, Jane, that's something you've spoken about before.
Yeah, I mean, I feel on Twitter, and it's not just me, but I watch a lot of my female colleagues. I feel that they're attacked in a sort of a more gratuitous and degrading way than their male counterparts are. I think it probably just reflects kind of a misogyny that people can express when they're not writing under their own names. They've got handles on Twitter where they don't have to own up to who they really are sometimes. And so I think it can still be quite ugly. There's still a lot of misogyny out there, and it pops up in a big and obvious way in social media. I see it with, Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, and it's just a very different tone than is taken to the males who are often. And I mean, you can see it also. It's not just on social media. I actually think that President Trump is more dismissive and ruder often to female questioners, and especially female questioners of color. I think he uses them as political foils to sort of to excite his base. And so he likes to show that he's kind of the boss and diss them. I mean, I think if I were sort of stepping back to where we are today, I think politically the press is in a much more dangerous position than we were before. But I think women in particular, in our profession, despite all this misogyny that we see online, I think we're doing much better than we were when I came into this profession. I think it's far from perfect, and there is still this kind of degrading attitude a lot of the time and dismissive. But it was so bad 40 years ago when I became the White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. I covered the White House, but my bosses told me I couldn't cover arms control because women didn't really understand it well. And so when there was a big arms control summit, I was supposed to stay home, and I was told to write a piece instead about Nancy Reagan's favorite dress designer. I think it was Adolfo. And, I mean, these things really did happen. When I questioned Reagan in a White House press conference, and I had written a story about how he called on women who wore red, he called on me and he said, "There's the little girl who started it all." And you were a little girl, even if you graduated with honors from Yale. So things have, I think there's, I see women in much more powerful positions in our profession and covering every kind of beat. And it makes me so happy to see this progress and women of color too, especially. And but meanwhile, I see that, I think that this issue of calling us enemies to people has made it we're at a very dangerous moment for the press in terms of politics. And that's for all of us women.
So women have made a lot of progress. We're still vastly underrepresented, particularly in newsroom leadership, but the situation is far worse for women of color and for people of color in general. And I referenced earlier this racial reckoning that's going on nationwide, but let's talk about how are our newsrooms meeting that moment? Do we feel like we have made the right progress, and what do we need to do to meet the moment?
Well, what's interesting is that a few newsrooms really quickly responded over the summer with measures that they thought would help engender racial diversity in their newsrooms. The LA Times appointed a masthead editor who's in charge of diversity and inclusion. So did the Washington Post, actually. And we at the New York Times, a lot of the leadership is actually devoted to figuring out how to recruit and also, more importantly for us, retain the talented journalists of color that we have. So I think there's been a real focus on this, which is heartening to see. I think that many of the journalists of color I talk to, the biggest fear is that this is fairly short-lived, and that once the news cycle changes, in 2021, that there won't be lasting change. So there's a lot of skepticism and trepidation, even though from what I've seen, publishers and leadership ranks across many media organizations that are really doing deep dives into this. One thing that has also been striking and heartening personally is that many journalists of color I've talked to have also felt more valued than they had at any time in their career. So I think that has been extremely positive.
It does seem, though, that one of the issues that we haven't quite gotten our arms around yet, it started with women, and now we see it with people of color, which is we say, oh, we're going to write stories about. And so those topics are almost siloed as separate from real news. And it does seem that we need to get to a spot where we understand that every story, every issue that we're looking at encompasses women, it encompasses people of color, and that they are not a separate topic.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that, for example, one storyline that's cropped up over the summer is that the multi-generational household, right? We're all in lockdown, and people who have children are returning home, or people who don't are returning home for more space. The one thing that's it's not rare necessarily in Black families to have multi-generational households. It's not uncommon among other communities of color. So that's an example of a story that if you look at it from just one perspective, you might cover it in a limited way. And that's an everyday. It's not a Black story or white story, but that's an example of a story that you should sort of pay attention. And again, render the truth in the most complete way that you can. So for us, that meant doing a couple of the stories that are sort of, lighter about the fact that, people are moving home in their childhood bedrooms, and it's probably not that fun for anyone involved. And also doing stories on the fact that there are multi-generational households who don't have a lot of space necessarily, and find this period of time particularly challenging because if any of them get sick, if they don't all want to abide by the same rules, it's very fraught.
And you make a great point, Monica, about this short attention span. Are we going to just move on? Like, we're thinking about it now, but tomorrow we're going to think about something else. And I want to go to Sarah with this point, because Sarah, you are one of the preeminent writers about immigration, migration. And one of the frustrations that I've seen, that I have personally, frankly, is as I'm looking at the coverage, is how quickly we move on from these truly, truly monumental stories, particularly as it pertains to immigration. And one of the ones that just broke my heart was, we had sustained coverage for a very brief moment about children being separated from their parents and how it's possible that the government didn't even know how to reunite these children who had been separated from their parents. And then it just seemed to drop, that story. And I'm wondering, where do you come down on that? Is this still happening at the border? Are there children who have not been reunited with their families?
Yeah, I think it's important that we do take note of all of the incredible immigration reporters who have been covering this, from the get-go when the Trump administration was trying to silently and quietly test the policy, all the way to the height of the family separation crisis when they declared zero tolerance. I think it would be almost mischaracterizing it to say that people moved on, in the sense that, first of all, it's one of the rare illustrations of this whole administration where media coverage actually did make a profound difference. You had so many people covering this from so many angles. And then the public actually listened, and they cared, and they wept alone in their bedrooms, but they also took to the streets, and policy was changed. And I think it's really important to note that, even though the administration continued to tell a very false narrative about what they did and didn't do. And even as Kristen Nielsen and the president himself were proclaiming that, this wasn't a formal policy, reporters worked hard to use, FOIA, using public records to ascertain, all the correspondence that documented that this was in fact a strategic plan. And many people have continued to cover it really rigorously since. And in fact, I think it's one thing that the Trump administration has brought new visibility to that frankly did not exist as much during the administration. Because I have to say, although those two administrations are radically different in terms of their immigration policy, I will say that, for instance, family detention was a widespread phenomenon during the Obama administration, and many people, editors were reluctant to assign things about that. People were, as readers, often reluctant to pay attention. And I think, this short attention span didn't start recently. I remember covering the surge of unaccompanied children at the southern border. I believe that was the summer of 2015. And that was a great example where everyone suddenly paid a lot of attention to all of these asylum seekers from Central America showing up at the southern border. These kids were being either, kept in these really abysmal detention centers with their families in some cases, or kids being held alone in pretty awful conditions. And I remember, that was all over the front pages, and then suddenly we forgot about it at the very moment that those kids were entering into the most high-stakes dimension of their case, which was the moment they went before a judge to get deported. So you had 3-year-olds going before a judge by themselves. And so I think it's really important to both take note of all the incredible reporting that is in fact happening and is in fact making a difference, while also noting the need to sustain that attention no matter what happens in the next presidential election.
This, though, does get to the issue of how many huge stories are breaking all at the same time right now. And we are in an industry that is under-resourced, that is under financial pressure. How do we keep our eye on the ball as we go forward particularly through the end of this year?
That is I think that silence speaks volumes. I work at a pretty large, news organization, so I think we have been fortunate, and I'm sure my peers here perhaps feel the same way, that we've been fortunate that we in the last 2 years, the company made some business decisions that allowed us to reinvest in our journalism and our journalists. So, the story we have found connect with our audience and our readership the most are those sort of deep investigations that you can't find anywhere else. We cover news, but we've sort of doubled down on the stories that we find that are really time and labor intensive, but it just tell you a lot about this country, about the president. And so we're just going to continue to do that, and we feel fortunate that that we have the support of the publisher in doing it.
Go on.
I just going to give a shout out to the lessons of one of my teachers at Yale, which was John Hersey, who taught a nonfiction writing class. And it was about the craft of the writer. And I think one of the things we have to do, it's old fashioned, but it's just really tell these stories really well so that we get readers because they're such compelling stories, and think about bringing the characters to life and try to connect the dots between all the complicated things going on in this world that we cover and why it matters, and bring it right home to readers. And so, so long as we keep doing that, no matter what the finances of the news business are, I feel there's a huge demand in this country and around the world to try to figure out, to get the news and get those kinds of stories.
We have a flood of questions coming in, so I'm going to try and get to as many as we can. Here's one for Tessa. What a scoop for Tessa to have been assigned to Trump early on, among other peripheral candidates. Tessa, did you get a sense early on he might actually win the nomination? And if I could just add to that question, what is your feeling right now?
Oh, gosh. Okay. So first time around, I actually think that was a time when I really wished that I had been a little bit older and covered other campaigns, because, as I said, I was assigned to him right off the bat, and I was going to numerous rallies. And these rallies, we all know he can exaggerate his crowd size, but genuinely his rallies are huge, and he continues to, and from pretty much the beginning, he was filling sports stadiums. And I figured that wasn't typical, but I didn't really have the benchmark to know how unusual that really was. So, I remember being really struck when I went to Iowa around the caucuses, and I got to see some other candidates for the first time. And I went to a Rand Paul event at a racetrack, and there were like 10 people there. And that was my first inkling where I was like, maybe there is something going on with Trump. But I trusted the conventional wisdom that was out there. So no, I was still surprised on election night. And this time around, I don't know. I think I and a lot of other people are wary of counting him out because of what happened last time. I think if you look at most conventional metrics of an incumbent president facing what he's facing with the racial reckoning in the country, the midst of a global pandemic that has claimed more than 200,000 American lives, the polling, I think if you look at most conventional metrics, it probably looks like he's going to lose, but he has always had kind of a secret sauce. So we'll find out.
So here's a question about social media. How can we implement regulation or reform of social media because of, it's creating these filter bubbles that has created and led to this greater polarization?
I guess the question is how can the country enact legislation, or more how can journalists shine a light?
The question asked about regulation and reform. We do know that Facebook has clearly set up these filter bubbles. The others have as well, but we've seen increasingly also the spread of false information, of misinformation. And I would broaden the question to ask, how do we combat that spread of misinformation, polarizing information, malinformation on the social platforms?
Well, one proposal has been to have the social media companies subject to libel laws the way that publishing companies are and newspapers and magazines are. It would require a change in the law, but I, in my own experience, the threat of a lawsuit is certainly very effective in keeping one from telling lies on purpose. And there are pros and cons with this, but I know a lot of people who think that would be a very helpful situation if the social media platforms were subject to some kind of legal penalty for libel.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that we as journalists can do, I've heard that advanced, although I do wonder how users, the sort of DNA of social media is that users upload information, and so we are regulating. I don't know how you regulate user behavior, but one thing that we as journalists, I think, can do, and we've started doing at the Times, is calling out and debunking misinformation. We used to not do this as much because, debunking it can give it more attention. As you mentioned earlier, this is something that politicians can do, but a lot of misinformation is already getting enough of an audience that debunking it is not going to spread it. So we're covering this as a beat. So when Sonoma County yesterday, for instance, their election officials have been besieged by this image of mail-in ballots in a landfill, supposedly didn't happen, but we ran a story on it, and we're continuing that line of coverage. And we're also, we have an R&D team that's devoted to investigating misinformation and how it spreads.
Perhaps you could mention, Monica, the work that Kevin Roos is doing, which is squarely on this topic.
Yeah, that is his entire beat. And we've have two categories of misinformation coverage. One is related to the election, and one is just general misinformation, not election related, so general mayhem. So I actually don't know if it was Kevin or it might have been another reporter who did a story this week on, there was a viral image going around showing that NBA players had observed Ruth Bader Ginsburg passing by wearing lace collars. Not true. It was a photoshopped image. It was originally just, I think, from a satirical site, but this gained traction in some conservative circles who think that the NBA is overly political. So we have this misinformation tracker and stories and viral stories that are absolutely false that have gone wrong. We regularly publish those now.
And
is there anything?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to jump in and say Time is a much smaller place than the New York Times, and in our DC bureau in particular, there's like between 10 and 15 of us. And we have some reporters who are really focused and dedicated on misinformation as well as it relates to the election. So even with a rather small pool of journalists working on political issues, it's such an important story. And going back to what Jane was saying earlier about kind of pulling back and she was talking about the lies and telling kind of the broader picture. I think that's also really important with misinformation. And as Monica was saying about how it spreads and looking at this ecosystem of how it proliferates, especially as it relates to the upcoming election.
We have a related question asking about how can readers, if you have any advice for people who would like to fact check the information that is coming through their social feeds or any information.
Well, it's a good instinct. I mean, the first thing is to question it, I think. And, I think, I find, I mean, while we're bashing social media, there's a tremendous amount of great information online at the same time. It's incredible what you can find out quickly as a reporter. You just have to really consider the source. It's sort of rule number one in reporting. And you can usually, I think, question it and check. And you can do it yourself quite easily online a lot of the time. So check out who you're listening to. And especially do that before. The other thing that I find is even friends have retweeted things I see often that maybe are a point of view that I might agree with, but are just plain wrong. And you just got to be really careful what you spread yourself. And I think in this issue right now that we're all looking at, which has to do with whether this election is going to be fairly decided, and the issue of say voter fraud, both the left and the right are at this point, I think, hyping to some extent the the question of voter fraud. And maybe not intentionally, they're probably both sides are really worried about it. But if you talk to, be careful. You're going to be really careful how we cover this next election, not prematurely, call out any results and check those. We've checked with the election units and everything else. And readers need to really just go online and check carefully. Check yourself all the time.
Yeah, for concerned readers, I would say make sure you have a news source or multiple news sources you trust and see if you can verify it there. And I would say the New York Times, the New Yorker, and Time are all excellent options. But if you just see something in a tweet, the best way to check it would be to see if, again, reputable news sources are covering it and if you can verify it there.
I think it's also worth noting that the onus shouldn't be exclusively on the reader. I think another thing readers can do is actually continue to put the pressure on tech companies to even just have simple accountability and transparency around these algorithms. I know the Center for Humane Technology just put forth a study that said that a tweet is 17 times more likely to be retweeted if it contains some kind of outrage term. So, Monica, I totally agree with what you were saying about user appetites are what they are. But in other ways, I do feel like they're pre-structured, given the way these algorithms work, to push people in certain directions, just the way we saw that YouTube was pushing people after they watched a video into directions that were more likely to show white supremacist content or take them in certain directions that were really problematic. So I think another thing readers can do is to continue to push for that kind of accountability.
And to be aware also of the kind of things you're talking about, Sarah. Actually, I've done some work on this. MIT Media Lab has looked at false news stories versus true news stories and found that the false news stories travel as much as 11 times faster than the true news stories do. The other there's been other research that has shown that the emotion that is most viral is actually anger, and so those who are trying to manipulate all of us know this. They know that the false information and the one that gets us all riled up, that's the information that's going to go viral and that's going to travel. And so we do need to be aware of that. We only have a couple of minutes left. We really haven't discussed at all sort of what it's like to be a woman in journalism now, because there's so many other huge issues that we have to deal with here. But we do have questions from readers about that, about, specifically, what do people not know about being a female journalist? What sets us apart, or what do we bring to the party? Each of you can quickly answer that one.
I'll go really quickly. I have to say that right now, there is a lot of there's near gender parity. In my newsroom, I think actually women may currently be overrepresented. I do think that in media in general, we look at the numbers, and what I would love to see more of is women in leadership roles. We are still really, dogged, hard workers, and we especially in this moment, women are doing, who have families, are doing most of the childcare and housework. And I think the impulse has been to sort of keep our nose to the grindstone. And I've been a big advocate of peeking out above your laptop monitor and raising your hand for more leadership roles.
Anyone else?
I think I'm just think when you say raising your hand, you think of a great story that Nancy Pelosi told, which was I think it's in her autobiography or something, where she said she was sitting around with a bunch of male colleagues, and each of them was talking about what their experiences was with childbirth, and how hard it was when watching their wife have baby number 3 or number 4, and how they took the picture, they got right in there and they did it and everything. And she was the only female, and she had, I can't remember, is it 4 or 5 children herself? And nobody asked her anything about the fact that she actually had the babies. And she said she took from that you know what, you can't really wait to be asked. you're going to have to raise your hand, or maybe not even raise a hand. Just jump in and say, well, let me tell you what I know, and do it. Because you can't really just wait to have someone politely ask you. So it takes a little bit of jumping in, I think, sometimes. The other thing I was going to say is, I think in my own case anyway, you can kind of, one of the experiences I've had, maybe the others of you haven't had it that much, but I've had the experience of being underestimated, maybe because I'm, a 5'2" female or whatever, and you can really make that work for you. They don't see you coming. And I think sometimes that's a great thing. So I don't know what other people would say, but those are two thoughts of mine.
We are just about out of time, but I would simply add to that it is so important to have women like you guys coming up, continuing this leadership role in journalism. One of the things that is most important is we are the essentially gatekeepers in deciding what is news and what is not, and what to cover. And when you don't have the female perspective, when you don't have the person of color perspective, you lose a lot. So we really need that perspective to come through. And I would encourage all the younger Yale grads that this is we need you. We need more women, more people of color. I want to thank all of our panelists. This was an incredible conversation. We could keep going all day long, but I know that our time is up. So thank you so much, and keep on doing your great work.
Thank you so much.